Delighted to be chairing this webinar on fiscal policies for a green economy on behalf of Global Government Forum, the publishing house that works with civil servants all around the world. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to our knowledge partner today, that's Microsoft. Now, in terms of today's topic, governments have used fiscal policy to shape their economies and influence behaviours for a long time. But when it comes to tackling climate change, tax and subsidy regimes can and will provide some of their most obvious and powerful tools. Over recent years, many countries have already affected change in citizens' and businesses' behaviours by taxing polluting activities, for example, and implementing subsidy regimes on emissions reduction projects such as home insulation and renewable power generation. As ministers and civil servants look to realising the goals agreed at COP26, they are considering how to apply fiscal levers to an even wider range of activities. But this is not always straightforward. In particular, at the moment, the pandemic has hit countries, communities, and individuals extremely hard. So governments are also having to consider how they rebuild economies and provide new income streams, whilst at the same time transitioning to a sustainable future. Now, we have a fantastic panel with us here today, and we'll be discussing all of those issues and much more with our panel in a moment. But this is also an opportunity for you, our audience, to put your questions to the panelists. So before I introduce our panel, I'd just like to say that on your device, whatever you're using, there'll be a Q&A function. You should see that on your screen somewhere. At any point from now on, please use that Q&A function to send in your questions. And once we've had opening presentations from our panel members, we will then turn to those questions and get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel today. First, we will hear from Joy Airy Kim, who is head of the Green Fiscal Policy Team in the Economy Division at the United Nations Environmental Programme. Joy has worked in the area of macroeconomic and environmental policies for over 20 years. And in her current role, she advises countries on their green economy transitions and fiscal policies for sustainability. Before joining the UNEP, she worked as an economist and senior policy analyst at the OECD in Paris, supporting global negotiations on climate change and trade. Then we will hear from Peter Lim, who is Director in the Fiscal Policy Directorate of the Ministry of Finance in Singapore. Prior to that, Peter served as Special Assistant to the Deputy Prime Minister and Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies. He was also Deputy Director at the National Population and Talent Division and a manager in the Singapore Youth Olympic Games Organising Committee. Then we will hear from Valentina Ion, who is the Director of Government Public Finance Industry for our knowledge partner Microsoft, where Valentina's focus is to advise governments embarking on their digital transformation journeys, including how that supports their environmental, social, and economic objectives. Valentina has more than 21 years' experience in ICT and business transformation. And then last, but by no means least, we will hear from Miguel Gil-Tetra, who is head of the Economic Analysis and Foresight Unit at the Directorate General for Energy in the European Commission, extremely busy place at the moment, I imagine, where he is responsible for ensuring the economic coherence of the EU Commission policy proposals in the field of energy. With a career of 15 years at the European Commission, Miguel has also worked on economic policies during the Euro crisis, the economic response to COVID, and designed the investment plan for Europe known as the Juncker Plan. So I'm sure you will agree we have a real stellar panel with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity to send us in your questions. But for now, I'm going to invite Joy to give us her opening comments. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting UNEP to this extremely timely webinar, I must say, as we know that many countries are still facing severe fiscal constraints, while at the same time they need to respond to the pandemic and they need to build resilience to climate change, and they need to get back on track to achieve sustainable development goals. Next one, please. So I must start my intervention by looking at the recovery spending. This unprecedented scale of public spending we have seen to recover from the current pandemic. And this kind of shows, what fiscal policy and government spending can set the directions for our economy and society in the coming decades, if you like. UNEP, together with the University of Oxford, has developed a global recovery observatory, which actually shows that globally 18 trillion US dollars were spent. Out of that, 3 trillion US dollars were recovery related. And yet we only see a 31% of the recovery spending, less than 1 trillion US dollars were green. And this is a missed opportunity, unfortunately, as the IMF also shows that the economic multiplier of the economic recovery vis-a-vis the business as usual would be 7 times higher. And we could have actually set the direction of our society and economy in a different way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all the hopes are gone. So we can actually look at where we stand right now with what we have and what improvements we can make. Next one, please. The first thing that we can actually look at it is all these perverse incentives that are very heavily burdening our budget, national budget, and have a significant negative impact on our environment. Fossil fuel subsidy is one of them, which ranges from 370 billion US dollars to 6 trillion US dollars if you take account of the cost of externalities, according to the IMF. And we know that by removing such fossil fuel subsidies, it could actually contribute to decreasing carbon emissions. Next one, please. Fossil fuel subsidy removal also has a huge benefit in terms of reducing pollutions and then have a positive impact on our health. The IMF report shows that by eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, if you combine that with the taxing fossil fuels, can cut the premature air pollution deaths by more than half. So there is a huge benefit in terms of removing fossil fuel subsidies, positive impact on our health, and then reducing our pollutions. Next one, please. We also know that by removing fossil fuel subsidies, it would actually create much needed fiscal space. What we actually have seen in 2020, Nigeria, for instance, they took a decision to phase out petrol subsidies, which was estimated to create 2 billion US dollars annually. And over the past years, globally, we actually have seen many countries who actually attempt to remove fossil fuel subsidies, although it actually fluctuated with the oil price fluctuating as well. Next one, please. Another perverse incentives, they also have a negative impact on our environment and our health, is agriculture subsidies. A recent UNEP, FAO, and UNDP report shows that almost 650 billion US dollars were provided as agriculture support and subsidies a year, and a bulk of that is price distorting or harmful to nature and health. And if we can repurpose such subsidies, a World Bank report shows that it could also restore about 105 million hectares of land to natural habitats with large potential biodiversity benefits. Next one, please. Another fiscal instruments that we can consider, and particularly post-COVID period, because there is a need to revisit our tax systems, and there is a role that indirect taxation, such as environmental taxations, can play a role to create this fiscal space, is environmental taxations. And we have seen again during the COVID period that countries like Costa Rica and India have increased the tax on transport fuels, in this case particularly to raise funds for COVID-19 recovery programs. We know that there is also great potential to raise revenue with the carbon taxations, which could amount to 1 to 2% of GDP, according to the IMF. And the research shows that in 2019, carbon taxes generated 29.5 billion US dollars, although we know that the tax base is going to be eroded with the carbon taxes. Another environmental taxations that could be looked at is pollution taxes, like chemicals pollution taxes. And we have seen, for instance, in Sweden, the fertilizer taxes over the years raised annual revenue around 30 million euros. This doesn't, of course, mean that there is no challenges associated with implementing these environmental taxations. Particularly when it comes to pollution taxes, it is difficult to set the optimal tax rate due to the inconsistency and toxicity related to the pollutants. There are still, in many developing countries, administrative limitations on capacity to implement environmental taxations and collect revenues. Next one, please. This just to show that despite all that we have seen in over 80 countries, they have included some sort of fiscal policy measures in their nationally determined contributions, which actually demonstrates that fiscal policy instruments can be extremely useful to fight against climate change, but as I have mentioned, to fight against pollutions and preserving nature. Next one, please. This is the last one, just to conclude that at the end, addressing these perverse incentives and introducing environmental taxations, they are all very practical and then useful. But ultimately, if we really want to understand and improve the alignment of national economic policy making with national sustainable development strategies, what we need is a sustainable budgeting, because it would actually enable us to have more targeted and efficient allocation of public resources. And it can also send a very powerful signal to development finance institutions and investors about countries' long-run growth prospects. And UNEP, together with the University of Oxford, has developed a sustainable budgeting approach, which we actually are working with the several countries, supporting them to provide advice with the customizable and accessible tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joy. And what a brilliant presentation to start with there, because I think you've set out a lot of issues I think that our other panel members and the audience will want to come back to. So that, as you say, that moment in time where governments are having to respond to the pandemic whilst they're also addressing kind of climate change. Really interesting what you set out there in terms of that recovery observatory and how only less than a third has actually been spent on what you would say green kind of investment, and what a missed opportunity that might have been. Really good to see those kind of the way you set out the perverse incentives there, but also what could be done if you did things like increasing environment taxation and then use that to raise money for recovery funds, for example. And I'm sure people will have questions about the sustainable budgeting work that you're doing, because that's so important in terms of bringing all of those different strands together. So thank you so much, Joy. Fantastic opening presentation. Peter, I'm going to come to you now.
Yeah, thanks very much. While the topic is about fiscal, I think the challenges we're dealing with encompasses a much larger set of issues. I was attempt to speak from an Asian perspective and as a practitioner of some of these issues, and I fully agree with what Joyce said. My perspective is, in a sense, a mix of advanced economy and emerging market consideration. I unfortunately had to rewind the clock back a bit to first examine how we got here, and this is important because I think it makes a very important point. If you look at the development history of most countries, for a period about 30 years after World War II, we had what we call a very good virtuous upward spiral around the world. The frontier of technology was improving rapidly. Almost every country, every region was experiencing growth and economic convergence. And you had global capital flows, which were aided by multilateral institutions, and it aided the development and convergence of almost every country. Of course, it has a share of crisis and challenges, but if you look at the rise in living standards, both within and across country, it was remarkable. And then if you look at the next 40 years, the last 40 years, especially the last 20 years, this has been wholly unexpected. The frontier productivity halved, inequality within and between countries widened. You have large regions of the world, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, which is a sizable part of the world population, where productivity growth was essentially flat. So this generation stagnation was in spite of very large scope for catch-up. And all this happened while global debt skyrocketed to its highest level as % of GDP. You have large increase in global financial flows, such that multilateral banks and official development assistance is only 1% of international capital flows in developing countries. I'll come into some of this issue. I just want to give you a backdrop of what's happening. And of course, there are some regions around the world that still manage to retain the virtuous upward spiral, but pretty much in the last 40 years, it was an exception rather than norm. And these are the trend before COVID, mind you. Before COVID, that virtuous upward spiral was already fragmenting within societies and globally, and it's only widened with COVID. And I say all this to give a sense of reality check. You know, we are really up against 40 years of headwind in restarting the virtuous upward cycle globally. There's nothing sustainable about our ever increasing debt. There's nothing sustainable about ever increasing consumption of limited natural resources. But if you look at inclusivity in societies, in neighborhoods, in workplace, between countries, there has not been much progress. And that itself is a source of fragility in many countries. So I think before we start on this topic, it's hence critical to ask ourselves, how can green fiscal policy be part of restarting that virtuous upward spiral everywhere? Because climate change and inclusive growth, I think, are the defining challenges of our time, and they must be addressed together. And they can only succeed if both succeed. And that's my strong opinion. So how to do so? I think we have to be very clear on our principles, we have to practice them, then we have to refashion a new active role for the state. On principle, it's really not that hard, but it's very difficult in practice. And that is, we must be honest about the challenge and confront it together. We take a lot of pride in democratic societies that people can speak truth to power. That is critical. But too often nowadays, those in power have not told the truth to the people. What are the costs? What are the challenges of climate change? And then differences are papered over, and then problems stock up. We take a lot of pride in our social democratic models that everyone chips in and the state provides, but too often, it is often just the second part of that promise or the compact, right? But without that shared responsibility, it's very difficult to have a shared vision. So that's about the principle. Then we have to apply them, and I think my fellow panelists, Joy, explained many of these, how to apply some of this principle into many domains, right? I'll make a few points on this quickly. First, there has been a lot of movement on financial disclosure standards, and I think that's a good move, but we're not there yet. I think there are a lot of efforts at a global, regional, and national level. I think my fellow panelists will speak more about it. In a small way, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, that is our central bank, also contribute to this, and we hope to see a standard develop together the US SEC work group, the IOSCO and the IFRS on this issue. But beyond financial disclosure for companies, there's also this issue of externality pricing, which I think Joy has talked about. I'll mention two things. First, it's not just about carbon tax price. You need the right price and an adequate level of coverage. And we know that around the world, many places, even with high taxes, have quite low coverage. And we have to ensure there is high coverage of any kind of carbon pricing agreement. Singapore itself has our carbon tax about 80% coverage, and we are progressively raising it to up to $50 to $80 by 2030. Then on the other hand, I think we talk about externality of fossil fuel. The point I'll make is that most of it is nothing to do with global warming costs. It is direct externality to local communities. And so if you put some of these together, a very strong microeconomic case can be made, right? You tax the externality and you provide offset, especially to more vulnerable groups. And that is the microeconomic case, right? But this brings me to my third necessary ingredient to make this all happen, right? Which is that you need a new active role for the state. Because while these principles and practice are important in the fundamental block, and you have to be truthful with people of the transition and use the tax and subsidy levers to engineer this transition, to really do it well, you need the state to play a very active role, right? Because you must remember that we are dealing with very significant structural headwinds. And many of the issues of inequality and stagnation runs very deep. We cannot just layer on another layer of carbon tax and transfer and hope for the best. And I only say this because I have a lot of humility as a practitioner in this art of policymaking. And I think our green effort must be part of the solution in restarting that virtuous upward spiral. And what do I mean? I'll just give 3 examples. I don't have a lot of time. First, we know there are opportunities. There will be new jobs created from the green transition as well as the green economy. But we also know that the skill gap between those whose jobs will be displaced and the new skill is very large, right? You have for example, you look at the technical skills needed to produce, install, and maintain renewable energy, very different from those that's needed to run fossil fuel stations. And therefore, we need active labor market intervention. And this is very important because the transition is fast, And to be frank, in most countries, both sector-based and location-based training infrastructure are not well developed. And we know that because we have already seen what the impact of this shortfall with regards to globalization and technological disruption, right? You see in advanced economy, the hollowing out of middle-class jobs, in emerging countries, the premature deindustrialization. And so we know there is a problem there, and therefore we cannot afford for the same issue to crop up in this green transition. So the state must organize the connection between new industries and training institute, aggregate the industry-wide needs, and have the active labor market policy to support that transition. Second, coherence with social and economic strategies. The green transition must be integrated with our existing and new social economic strategy. This includes many areas, including social urban living, which are both sustainable and inclusive, public policies on energy and transport, to even municipal issues such as recycling, waste collection, and cooling system, right? So it must be integrated, right? And in many areas, this includes also public investment. And this is especially so for emerging economies. So in many emerging economies, investments in public transport is sorely lacking. But if you think about this growth and green trade-off, there isn't that trade-off, right? It has huge long-term payoff in both sustainability and growth. Last point, supply side financing. I mentioned this earlier. We live in quite unorthodox time. We have global liquidity at an all-time high, yet unlike the post-World War II era, developing economies by and large cannot run persistent current account deficit to invest and grow. At the same time, you have the spending in advanced economies, which have grown and shifted from investment towards social transfer and is funded by ever-increasing debt level. This strange mix of global capital flow is a complex issue, and I'm not trying to trivialize it, and it operates at both international institution and local governance level. But the point is, we have to develop mechanisms and instruments and partnership to ensure that debt can and should be used to finance worthwhile green investment. We know there's a lot of appetite, but it's not happening, right? So I'm suggesting we need to think about the supply side debt strategy to address this. I give you an example. So Singapore, we recently restarted government borrowing. So aside from the usual debt control, we have the debt and interest rate limit. We also decided to include supply side control. So debt can only be used to finance large intergenerational public infrastructure like public transport and climate change. These are long-term investment. You need to make the payoff immediate. You need to spread the cost and benefit to match each other. And I do believe there's a lot of scope for supply side debt strategy, especially for green investment in developing economies. But it requires close work, both at the international institution level, but also with local government to ensure there's capability, some of the issues that Joy mentioned, and also providing that policy clarity to investors. It's only with this then the capital will flow. So I know I've exceeded my time. I just want to give a sense of a realistic assessment of what we're up against and how we might move forward. I know it's not easy, but I think if you're honest and we have a comprehensive plan and we can think very actively about what is the new role of the state, I think we can address this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I mean, really fascinating. You've kind of stood back, given us that really big picture, but I think been very, very honest about some of those big challenges. So as you say, the warning signs were there before COVID, that what we were doing wasn't sustainable on a global level. I like what you keep saying about the green fiscal policy has to be the start of a new way of thinking about that virtuous upward cycle. So what needs to be done differently now? And then very much stressing that new active role for the state, because this transition is not going to happen on its own. So things like the skills gap, how are governments going to help with that? And I think what you were saying at the end there about integrating with other kind of socio-economic policies and looking at kind of the investment side and the supply side as well goes back to what Joy was saying about that whole kind of sustainable budgeting as well, and taking that kind of holistic approach. So some overlaps there, some similarities, as well as loads of stuff to unpick in those first two presentations. So to the audience, please do keep your questions coming in, because I think there's already been a lot of issues raised. I am now going to invite Valentina to give us her presentation. Over to you, Valentina.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, and very nice to connect with the audience and my fellow panelists. What I'd like to do is to take a moment to highlight how technology and digital transformation specifically can contribute in this space, being an instrument of execution and measurement of impact of the policy. as well as share the effort Microsoft is doing in sustainability and how we are supporting governments across the globe. So we can go to the next slide. This is just to highlight that it is now, and it's actually a yesterday type of urgency. This will happen in our lifetime. It's not for generations to come that they need to support. We only have 10 years left of carbon budget, for example, before life on our planet, on our home, becomes unbearable, more and more unbearable. So we all are accountable. This is not only a policy and a government accountability. All of us, individuals and organizations, need to contribute. And we can move to the next slide. It is about ecosystem. At school, the first time I've learned about ecosystem, it was at ecology, speaking about the environment, and sustainability by default is an ecosystem of ecosystems that need to come together. So moving to the next slide, what will be the digital sustainability opportunities for a greener public finance and fiscal policy contribution? Three things that I'll highlight here. First, of course, there's a lot of work that needs to happen still in terms of strategy, from policy to standards and capacity building, education and scaling of every single citizen on the topic. And then it's measuring of impact and measuring of compliance. If I decline it a bit more, of course, government and public finance organizations across the world have an important regulator role. They're setting the scene, the mechanism, either taxing more the heavy polluters of the world, or incentivizing good behavior. And EU Green Deal, for example, it's an amazing example of this. All the economic recovery funds have incorporated sustainability goals, objectives, or priorities, and that's an amazing step to come. ESG reporting becoming more and more the standard and becoming also an instrument used by different industries in order to loyalize their customer base, to offer a conscious choice to their customers, consumer. I think of transport and all the apps that are popping up, and you see, depending on your mobility trajectory and the multimodal choices you're making, what's the carbon impact. Similarly, banking and loans and capital markets are incorporating ESG impact in their services and offers. But then government needs to also become sustainable for itself in their day-to-day operations, in the way they are working. And remote work has proven to have a positive impact on the sustainability, less pollution from the traffic as an immediate benefit. Green cloud migration, there's a lot of innovation that goes in cloud, in data centers of big providers such as Microsoft, and adopting and leveraging those computing capacities will liberate and reduce the carbon footprint of any individual organization. We've mentioned about transportation, supply chain, and monitoring the origin of goods and the impact on the sustainability of each service, product and provider across the supply chain comes here into place as well. And here I consider procurement and even public procurement, of course. You can leverage practices that are already available in the private sector, where there's a criteria around sustainability and in selecting the vendors with key metrics. There are also efforts in building capacity, knowledge, and expertise on sustainability, supporting the current provider ecosystems to get there. Smart spaces, smart buildings, energy efficiency, monitoring then the carbon emissions and air pollution and the water consumption, waste, these are all extremely important, and the technology is already there to support. The challenge might come initially from the data acquisition and the recording, but with the Internet of Things, with all the sensors, and also with the capabilities of collaborating and sharing information, coming together as an ecosystem, that gap can be bridged. So we can move to the next stage. I'll highlight what we are doing and what are our commitments, and probably there'll be things that you can find useful for your own organization and work groups. And if we continue, our commitments go around carbon emissions, water security, waste management, and we are an organization that has a lot of partners, lots of ecosystems, digital, commercial around us, and we want to empower these ecosystems as well. We're applying our technology in achieving these goals, and you can see it's not far out. 2025, it's close by. 2030 would be the other important moment, and of course by 2050 we want to remove all historical carbon emissions. So not only get green and sustainable in the present, but reduce the impact we have had in our history. We can continue, and you see they're building a planetary computer, and we are making and will continue to make all the findings and these resources available to governments, to organizations that want to increase their efforts in sustainability area. We're already working with many governments, NGOs as well, on water security, on deforestation topics, biodiversity, climate, flooding risk, and so on. So these are some examples of the work we are doing currently. We can continue. And we're helping customers, and I'll just highlight some examples. One of them being, if we go to the next slide, Met Office in UK. How we have, but before going there, just wanted to highlight that we have productized all this work and all these findings from our past work into Cloud for Sustainability that offers key building blocks in order to facilitate the digital transformation and the journey to a more sustainable organizations and business. And this doesn't only apply to private sector, it applies to any organization, government included. Common data models, data visualization, reporting capabilities, goal tracking, extending solutions and integrating with solutions that other partners might provide. Catalog of information, and a lot of it it's accessible on an open software format. So if you want to start and leverage technology in the journey, this is a great way to start. And I was mentioning Met Office in UK. We can continue to the next slide. Data harvesting, it's the challenge when embarking into this, and we are working with them on the weather forecasting supercomputer, where our technology it's made available to analyze, ingest and analyze huge volumes of information. You see the numbers there, and it's not only from sensors in UK, it comes from across the globe back to the ecosystems idea, and whether it's not something that happens in isolation. There are influences across the globe, and all allowing all these teams to connect and come together will increase the accuracy of the weather forecasting and allow governments to take measures when we speak about flooding, for example, which is a big topic for UK. We can continue. We're also helping utilities companies in their decarbonization efforts and improvement of services, allowing not only to reduce the the consumption, but improve the consumption and involve prosumers, individual contributors into the smart grid. We can move to the next one. Helping into the production of green assets and reducing the printing, reducing the consumption of resources through digital assets, such as the example here for city insurance. And we go to the next example, because I know I don't have a lot of time, and helping investment decisions and ESG data analytics being a key factor that influence the decision, like we do it for BNY Mellon. This is what I wanted to share up front, and looking forward to your questions, comments, and looking forward to learn from my panelists as well, because it is important to learn from each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Valentina. So really good to have that slightly different view of an organization that works with the public sector, that works with governments around the globe, but starting by stressing the urgency of this. We don't have time to waste on this issue. All those ways in which kind of digital transformation can help with the green agenda, but very much kind of what you said there, things like using data on predictions, forecasting, on risk assessments, all of those things will help policymakers who are a primary audience today in terms of kind of evidence to support some of these decisions around the policies, fiscal and otherwise, that they need to take going forward. So thank you so much, Valentina. And then last, but by no means least, Miguel, we are coming over to you. Thank you.
Very good, and many thanks for inviting me to discuss such an important topic today. I mean, in my presentation, I will look at the point of view of the Green Deal, which is Europe's growth model, and how we are presenting these issues. I would look at both, the perspective of the private and the public sector. That recently the Commission adopted some decisions on the classification of certain investments within the taxonomy. There is also some work ongoing on issues like green budgeting. And I think it is important that, we have also some time to look into what have been the challenges, when doing this exercise, because of course, I think that the case for the green fiscal policies, is a clear one. I mean, it's a clear one from the economic point of view, from the social point of view as well. But of course, I mean, when implementing, these high-level principles, I mean, one might find, different challenges. So if we can go for the first slide, please. Okay, so I mean, this is just a little summary on what is the EU Green Deal. So as you know, the Green Deal is a strategy for a sustainable economic growth and for reaching climate neutrality by 2050 in the European Union. I mean, we have some legally binding targets like the minimum 55% of greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2030, and green national budgets have to send the right price signals. I mean, this was written in the Green Deal at the time. National budgets play a key role in the transition. Green budgeting tools should help to redirect public investment, consumption and taxation to green priorities and away from harmful subsidies. And the Commission will work with member states to screen and benchmark green budgeting prices. I think that, in the current circumstances, I mean, this is becoming even more necessary, I would say, than in the past. I think that now it is pretty clear that, these policies that look at the reduction, of, on the one hand, energy consumption, and, most clearly the, let's say, the reduction of the dependence on fossil fuels, they are not only good from economic point of view in the long term, they are also good, for, let's say, the environmental point of view, but they are also good from the point of view of the security of supply and the strategic autonomy, in the case of the European Union. So I would say that the case is even bigger than ever. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the case for sustainable finance. I mean, the EU has committed, to these, very ambitious targets. I mean, we see that the public sector alone will not be sufficient to meet these investment needs. The private sector will have to play a huge role, and a smart policy framework is needed to incentivize this private investment. So, I mean, we see clearly the role of fiscal policies as one of, catalyzing, the funds that are available in the markets. I mean, there are two main instruments that we can work on. I mean, clearly one is regulation. I mean, this is what governments and the public sector does, but we can only work at providing, de-risking tools. And, this is something that we have been working quite a lot. So instead of, let's say, providing, 100% of grants, I mean, sometimes 5% or 10% of the right, risk financing tools can crowd in, the private sector in order, to perform certain investments. Now, ourselves, in this work on sustainable finance, I mean, on the regulation part, I mentioned before, we are working on the taxonomy, and I think that this, is important that we stop 1 second on this point, because clearly the definition of what is green or what is harmful to the economy is not something, that is shared by everyone. I mean, I think that we live in a reality, where there is no simply, black and white, but people have different understandings of what is gray. And there, I think, or at least, from the point of view of the European Commission, for us, it is very important to have a science-based approach. There are clearly, items who are green in the, if the definition that we apply is, the greenhouse gas emissions that, they emit clearly. There are other types of, let's say, investments that, might have a role in decreasing, over, the total number of greenhouse gas emissions, even if they continue to emit. And this is, the role of certain transitional activities. I mean, this is how it has been defined in the context of the taxonomy. And then there are things that clearly we want to get rid of, and I mean, one very clear example is, the combustion of, highly contaminating fossil fuels like coal for the generation of electricity. So let's say the challenge is not, on those activities or those that are pure green, but the challenge is where do we put the cursor, for those activities that might be gray, and there, as I said, science-based approach, is, for us, the best, the best possible approach. Now, if we go to the next slide, okay, related to green budgeting practices, I mean, these practices, they differ a lot across member states. Now, the Commission did a survey last year on, green budgeting practices, and how, these are defined. We have 5 member states that, apply environmental impact assessment. We have 6 member states that, don't do green budgeting, but they tag the different, activities within their public budget according to their contribution to, let's say, green objectives. Then we have 6 member states that have plans for green budgeting. And then we have, 10 member states that have not yet showed an intention, to perform these green budgeting. Now, here, the challenge that we see is related, mainly to the methodologies that are applied, because, even those, member states that have green budgeting or tagging, let's say, methodologies, they don't necessarily apply the same methodologies, and therefore the comparison or the aggregation of different results is not always the best. So I would stop my presentation here, and happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. I mean, a really good way to end, I think, because what you've shown there in talking about the kind of EU Green Deal is how kind of some of those challenges, what some of those challenges are. So even when you have that kind of overall strategy, the overall objectives, just that final slide there showing how even within the member states, there's those real differences in terms of progress. But then the importance as well, you stressed there, of the private sector and how, what's the role of the public sector to incentivize private investment, and also the taxonomy. So there's still real issues around understanding about what is green and what isn't green, especially in those grey areas, which I think will be really important throughout this transition period. So what is kind of acceptable and what is not. And then really interesting what you said there about the reduction on dependence of fossil fuels, not just good for the environment, but I think something hugely topical, obviously, also good for security of supply, which I think lots of people will be thinking about in particular at the moment. So thank you so much for your presentations. To the audience, please get your questions coming in, use that Q&A function, but I want to kick off a bit of a conversation between our panel. Oh, and before we do that, just to say, I've seen there that to the audience, some links have been sent to you. So please do, you can copy those and look at those, especially from the, I think we had them from Valentina and also from Joy, things that you might find useful. And we will also send those to people who are registered after the event as well. But I guess to my panel members, so thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. One of the obvious, I think, questions, because you all mentioned this kind of moment in time that we are in, I just want your very quick thoughts on the extent to which COVID and the pandemic have actually made this harder. So even with the best intentions from governments, now that they are so focused, understandably, on having to kind of rebuild their economies, do you think they are going to kind of lose focus? Do you think their new priorities will mean they will miss opportunities? And do you think maybe that they will kind of make the decision actually that the green kind of issues can wait a bit while they deal with some kind of immediate issues about getting communities, individuals, businesses back on track? Joy, we obviously haven't heard from you for a while. I can see you nodding there. So just your thoughts on kind of COVID and how it's made this agenda harder.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, indeed, we have seen that this debt to GDP ratio in advanced countries during the COVID recovery period amounted to 20 to 30%, and for developing countries 10%. So it is very difficult time. I mean, there is no question about it. But when we actually look at the recovery spending, I think that it kind of became also clear that clearly there are also some low-hanging fruits that countries can easily grasp and then turn it into green spending. We have seen that the G20 countries actually continuously, I think they're probably out of inertia, provided fossil fuel subsidies as a part of recovery support without any conditionings. And this, I think that doesn't really make sense if they are serious about fighting against climate change. Other countries that are more championing when it comes to the recovery spending. So I think that actually set the good precedent for some other countries as well. I mean, I think that the Peter actually mentioned about the issue of debt, how we can perhaps, turn that into a round so that it can actually be feeding into a green investment. That's, I think that it's a hot topic. Countries are looking at it and discussing about it. It's a difficult subject matters to master, as we actually have seen over the past years, how this debt swapped to climate and nature has not been very made available. So I guess we still have a lot of challenges. There are some good lessons, at least, that we can draw from the recovery, at least period, what the countries have done. There are also some, easy way of turning things around to think. And I think that that's the reason why I think that our EU colleagues actually mentioned a lot about the green budgeting, and it varies among countries. This holistic view of green budgeting, I think it's really, really important, because if you set the goal, national goal on fighting against climate change, and you are providing a lot of support for renewable energy development, but you also do not actually make a link that you are at the same time providing a lot of fossil fuel subsidies. Countries need to understand how their money is being spent and what impacts eventually it would have. So you actually have to be able to see all the measures that are actually put in place, how much spending is being done, and what impact it would actually have, not only on environment, but economic and social, as Peter mentioned. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Well, you mentioned the EU there. So Miguel, I want to come back to you before I come back to Peter and Valentina. But in terms of that chart that you showed where people are on their different kind of place on that journey, what's the conversation at the EU level in light of kind of COVID recovery is there a concern that that will slow down progress against the Green New Deal, or are those things now coming together in a kind of helpfully integrated way?
I mean, I don't think so, because I mean, the plans that the EU had for the recovery put, very clearly green issues, at the center of it. And, and I think rightly so, in the past years, I mean, when, the recovery fund, which is called Next Generation EU, came in the European Union, the idea, at the time was that, at least 37%, of the spending was clearly, taxonomy aligned, if I can put it, this way in our terminology, which doesn't mean that the other 63%, is not green, but I mean that clearly, at least, around 40% of the spending of the member states was clearly, on the green side. And I think that we are not seeing, this, on the contrary, we see a big push, a strong push from the states, also probably, linked to, the deterioration in the markets, of fossil fuels in the past, in the past year.
Yeah, thanks, Miguel. So Peter, I want to come to you, because one of the things specifically that you mentioned, I think in particular, was kind of growing inequalities. And I guess in light of COVID, there will be some countries that are struggling more than others. So again, do you think that the pandemic has made it harder? And are we having, as you said, an honest conversation about those challenges? And where do you see the pandemic having changed that agenda?
Just quickly, I think for many emerging markets, I think the truth is there's significant, from a macroeconomic point of view, significant economic scarring, which means they are not going to get back to their pre-COVID growth trajectory anytime soon. So I think it's really difficult. I think there's a certain role for international institutions on that. But even putting that aside, across all countries, the way I'll put it is that actually, if you think about the external trends, I talk about all the issues we have, it's just gotten worse with COVID, and there's almost nothing that got better with COVID. But not to be wet blanket, but the one thing that has changed a lot from this crisis, I think, is the intrinsic desire to do better. I think that because we're exposed to our own fragilities, I think there's a lot of intrinsic desire to do better, build a better future, and all that. And so it's really a matter of leadership, right? And I think I agree with Miguel that I think the Europeans are really a leader in this front. I think they have tried to use as much as possible the opportunity of this crisis, no matter how hard it is, to signal a leadership change in where we should be headed. And I think that's very useful, but it's difficult. I'm very glad that at least Europe has shown a way on this front.
Thanks, Peter. Valentina, before we go, we've got a question coming in from the audience, but before we go, is that your experience of what Peter said there? Are you seeing with the governments and the civil servants you're working with, this desire to at least get some positives from the pandemic and to actually build that better future, and therefore to make sure we don't lose the focus on green kind of policies as we go forward?
Absolutely. And initially, the pandemic focused everybody to the health and safety of people. And that's where a lot of the budget have been reallocated. Now it's about the recovery of the economy and getting those people that have been impacted by the pandemic back into the workforce. And when you realize as a government and as an industry that sustainability creates value, sustainability creates jobs, then you can mutually support one with the other. That's the experience we've had.
Thanks, Valentina. So the first question we've had coming in is from John DeGiorgio. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that properly, but how important is GPP in this scenario? Are governments really procuring green supplies and services? I think this goes back to something, Valentina, that you mentioned as well about kind of the whole ESG kind of framework, but also I think it was Joy, were you talking about procurement as well, and kind of all of those kind of issues. So is there growing evidence that governments are changing their procurement practices to make sure that they procure greener supplies and services? Valentina, very quickly, I will come to you on this one, I think.
Yeah, I would say we start to see more and more evidence. Initially, we've seen it in UK, and I have in mind an example from DEFRA, where social value, and within social value criteria for eligibility of vendor, you had sustainability as well as digital skilling and creation of new jobs opportunity in specific regions. We see it with the Nordics governments as well, where there is also a move to measure impact and dynamically reallocate budgets depending on the impact of different programs and vendors would have. I'll stop here and because
Thanks, Valentina. Peter, from the kind of Singapore government perspective, is procurement and greener procurement something that's a priority over there?
No, certainly. And I mean, it takes many forms, include not just supplies, but even if you think about buildings, you can make the building a lot more green. And I think fundamentally it's about the government setting the standard or leading the way in pointing out where the private sector should follow. At the end of the day, we are responsible for the cost effectiveness of taxpayers' dollars. So it is really finding that right balance, but also sending very clear signal to where I think the economy should be headed. But this doesn't take away the need for all the things that Joy mentioned, setting the right carbon tax or even shadow carbon pricing, externality. So all those must get right first. And I think this is the added thing that we need to do.
Thanks. Miguel, is procurement an issue that you cover as well in your unit, or is that not something that you are focused on where you sit?
I mean, it is something where we work with, our colleagues in the Directorate General for GROW, which are the colleagues dealing with industry and the public market. So, I mean, we are, well aligned with them. I mean, we work very closely with them. But I mean, they would be better placed, on these matters.
Yeah, sure. Joy, would you like to add anything on the issue of kind of greener procurement? And do you see a shift? Are governments taking this seriously, and are they actually shifting their behavior in terms of procurement?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a very important issue and quite significant portion of government spending. When you actually look at the procurement itself, it's on average globally like 20 to 30% of GDP. That's procurement, not the green procurement. The green procurement portion is still small, but it is growing, and it's very important public spending that can actually turn into a green investment in public finances. So in addition, it can also create market development for this specific green product. So I do see, at least the UNEP also has a sustainable public procurement program, and supporting many countries on initiating this public procurement process and practices. It is changing, and it's expanding, and there are a lot of nitty-gritty and technical knowledge and guidance needed for many countries. But I do see that it's expanding and changing, and it's a very important area.
Thanks. Okay, I want to move on to our next question, and it's a slightly, probably a naive question, but I want to ask it in light of Joy, where you set out in your opening presentation just some of the options available to government. So you could beef up your environment taxes, and then you could use those, for example, to create money for recovery funds, for example. There are a range of subsidies that could be repurposed in the way that you set out. So in that context, and in light of the kind of urgency that all of you are aware of, the need to address the climate crisis quickly, my basic question is, why are governments not doing more? Why are governments moving so slowly? And just for our audience, what are the barriers and what are the challenges to this? Obviously, there will be bureaucracy, obviously there will be cultural issues, but what are the key barriers to change, and why are we not moving faster? Miguel, I'm going to come to you on this, bearing in mind that you sit across, the 27 member states. Why are there such differences? Why are some moving faster than others?
Sorry, if I may, I mean, I think that, one point clearly is, that, I mean, there are some levels of pedagogy, to be done in the public administration. I mean, I think that, these are issues, that are discussed at the level of specialists, that are sometimes discussed at the level of, high-ranked politicians and so on. But this is something that needs to happen at the level of each and every, let's say, different levels of the administration. And this is not something, that is inscribed in the day-to-day work of all the administration. So clearly, there is a need for a political push. Then I think another important challenge relates to the fact that methodologies are not standardized. I mean, the Commission is doing a big effort there. I think it would be easier, if we would have a standardization of the different methodologies, to do this, at the level of the fiscal policies. And then, I would say that beyond that, there are also, let's say, challenges at the level of means, of the public administration. I mean, I'm a firm believer of, the need to have, high quality public administrations, with sufficient IT tools, with sufficient training, of the public administration officials. And, sometimes in the context, that we are living today, I mean, this doesn't come as a top priority.
Okay. Thanks, Miguel. Peter, do you agree with that in terms of some of those challenges and why we're not moving faster? I mean, is standardization of methodology kind of a big issue?
Maybe I'll just add 2 points. First, you must recognize it's a global commons issue, right? So there's fundamentally coordination issues, not just within regions, but also globally. But I think I'll just say it goes back to the political economy issue. There are just so many issues that we're grappling with even before COVID. And that's why I said, if you want to think about really addressing climate change, it has to be integrated to restarting the inclusive growth engine. Because if you don't have that, you will always find it very hard to address this. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Joy, in terms of kind of the pace of change, obviously you would like to see things moving more quickly, but building on what Miguel and Peter have said there, do we have an understanding of which fiscal levers will actually have the best effect? I mean, is that something that's being worked on as well at a kind of national and global level?
What I can say is that, I mean, we have witnessed so many countries, attempting to remove or phase out the fossil fuel subsidies, for instance. There are some positive stories to be told. Countries learn the lessons from other countries, and they know, what it actually takes to address some of the political economic issues associated with fossil fuel subsidies, etc. There are some failure stories, there are some successful stories, but also, some countries like Indonesia and many countries, I would imagine that they just could not afford continuing because it's just a big dent in their budget and they had to do so. But we have also seen the Gilets jaunes in France and recently, I mean, with all the lessons of how it should be done when you introduce these things with a wide range of consultations, gradual introduction or increasing of a tax rate and all the knowledge that has been there, but it was done in such a way that actually created, the people, pushed people to the street. So I guess there is no shortage of knowledge and an understanding and communication strategy how to deal with the political economy aspect of it. There are some success stories that we can all share, and I think that that's important. I think that to be able to actually have a platform where all this knowledge and experiences can be shared with the other countries. There are some issues that are still sticky. I can understand that it's not easy, solutions to address and solve the problems. But I think that there's a lot of hope. I mean, and then one other one I would just mention about the agriculture subsidies. I mean, we also do see that there's a lot of challenges because it's the food producing countries, there is a lobby behind it. There are farmers unions, world farmers unions who actually have a stake involved. So it is very muddy field to sort of maneuver through, and then how they can actually all agree on taking actions that is, desirable for the green economy transition. But at the same time, I think that the idea of repurposing and how the different stakeholders can actually come to an agreement on changing the directions for more sustainability, I think that there is still a clear way to go, and then hope for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Valentina, I see you've answered a question, which is great. We had a question come in about can data be used to help kind of measure the impact of sort of carbon footprint of people's supply chain. So thank you for answering that question as well. I can't believe how fast the time is gone. We've probably only got time for one final question, but I just also want to say to the audience, thank you for sending in your questions, and also a questionnaire will have been sent out to all of our audience members. Please do take a few seconds, if you don't mind, to answer that question, because it means that we can make sure we give you the webinars that are of most use to you going forward. So thank you so much for that. So my final question then to all of our panelists here, and it builds on what Joy just said there about sharing good practice, I think, and also Miguel, kind of you're going back to that chart, which I really liked about the different member states. But these webinars are all about kind of learning from each other and sharing kind of good practice. So my final question is kind of who is leading the way on this issue? And do you have any kind of, would you like to highlight any particular countries or initiatives where you think fiscal policies are being used to best effect to really kind of change behaviours? Peter, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Certainly, I think.
Quite welcome to say Singapore.
No. Certainly, I mean, we do our little part to try to contribute better in knowledge and capabilities and all that. But I think if you take an honest look, I think the Europeans, and in particular, some of the northern European countries have really moved quite far ahead. And it's good because you need people to push the boundary and to set the pace. Otherwise, many of the issues of standardization or disclosure, like, it's very hard to move. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Miguel, would you agree with Peter that Europe is leading the way on this?
Indeed, I think, I mean, Europe is, a firm believer, as I said, not only because of economic and environmental concerns, but also security of supply concerns. Yeah. And, I think that this is, very much, in our mind, and we will continue it. And I think, I mean, that these ideas that, the COVID situation or the current spikes in prices, might put a halt into this, I think it is actually the contrary. Thank you.
Thanks, Miguel. I think that security of supply issues is going to see some big changes as well over the coming weeks and months. Valentina, you mentioned some case studies you're working with around the globe. Are there any particular countries that stand out from Microsoft's point of view?
Well, Singapore is on that list for sure. I was highlighting UK earlier, Nordics, Japan more recently, and there's a lot of activity also in Middle East and Africa, pushed by the need and the risks around water security, water supply, agriculture, and access to bioproducts. And we're also happy to have an ecosystem of partners supporting here with the research. And we're keeping a close look at the policy advancements, the learnings, and the best practices shared by people in this panel even.
Brilliant. Thanks, Valentina. So good to see lots going on different parts of the world. Joy, we started with you. I'm going to finish with you. Are there any particular kind of countries or particular kind of initiatives that you would like to highlight in terms of good practice?
Yeah, I've shared a link with everyone, Green Fiscal Policy Network. This is a partnership with many organizations, but in principle, basically IMF and the UNEP coming together with the German government to support, because we realized that we need to reach out to our respective constituency, which is Ministry of Finance for IMF and Ministry of Environment for UNEP. And I think that at least the idea that we actually need to bring these two ministries together and then speak to each other, and also provide a virtual platform where the countries, policymakers from both sides can actually come together and then share lessons learned and experiences over the difficult challenges about political economy, how they actually got over it, and how they actually address some of the issues related to green fiscal policy. So I would encourage audience to have a look at the website, and I think that there are also a lot of materials that countries may actually find it very useful.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you for sharing all those links. So we are actually out of time. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to a brilliant panel today. So thank you to Joy, to Peter, to Miguel, and to Valentina. I know how busy all of you are. It's an incredibly busy time for you, and to our audience for taking time out to come and listen to this webinar. But I think we'll all agree there's no bigger issue, I think, than discussing some of these things that will help address that climate crisis. So thank you so much for lending us your time and your expertise. Thank you very much to Microsoft for being the knowledge partner again today. And to the audience, just to say, we will send you a link of this video of the webinar. So to those people who weren't able to join live, they will be able to watch it, but you can also share it with your colleagues as well. And there will be a write-up of the webinar with key issues that came out of the discussion. So that will be sent to all the audience and it will be published on the Global Government Forum website in a couple of weeks' time as well. So wherever you are today, thank you so much for having joined us today. Thank you to our panel and enjoy the rest of the day. And I hope to see you again on one of our webinars very shortly. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.